Alphonse Gabriel Capone, a gangster and businessman, rose to prominence during the Prohibition era as the co-founder and leader of the Chicago outfit from 1925 to 1931. After 7 years as a criminal leader, he was imprisoned at the age of 33. Capone was born January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, a borough of New York City. His parents were Italian immigrants Gabriele Capone, 1865 to 1920, and Teresa Capone, 1867 to 1952. His father was a barber, while his mother was a seamstress. They were both born in Angri, a small commune west of Naples in the province of Salerno. Capone's family moved to the United States by ship in 1893, passing through Fiume, a port city in Austria-Hungary. The family settled at 95 Navy Street, in Brooklyn's Navy Yard neighborhood. When Al was 11, he and his family relocated to 38 Garfield Place in Park Slope, Brooklyn. Capone's parents had 8 other children: James Vincenzo Capone, who later changed his name to Richard Hart and became a prohibition agent in Homer, Nebraska; Raphael James Capone, also known as Ralph Capone or Bottles, who took over his brother's beverage industry; Salvatore Frank Capone; Ermina Capone, who died at the age of 1; Ermino John Capone; Albert Capone; Matthew Capone, and Mafalda Capone. Ralph and Frank collaborated with Al Capone in his illicit enterprise. Frank performed this till he died on April 1, 1924. Ralph initially oversaw Capone's bottling enterprises, both legal and illicit, and he also served as the Chicago outfit's frontman until his arrest for tax fraud in 1932. Al Capone showed promise as a student, but he struggled with the rules at his stringent parochial Catholic school. His education terminated at the age of 14 when he was expelled for punching a female instructor in the face. Capone performed various jobs around Brooklyn, including a candy store and a bowling facility. From 1916 to 1918, he played semi-pro baseball. Following this, Capone was inspired by mobster Johnny Torrio, whom he grew to consider a mentor. On December 30, 1918, Capone married May Josephine Coughlin, age 19. She was an Irish Catholic who had given birth earlier that month to their son, Albert Francis Sonny Capone, 1918 to 2004. Albert lost the majority of his hearing in his left ear as a child. Capone was under the age of 21, and his parents had to provide written authorization for the marriage. By all accounts, the couple enjoyed a lovely marriage. Capone first became linked with small-time gangs like the Junior 40 Thieves and the Bowery Boys. He subsequently joined the Brooklyn Rippers, and then the formidable 5 Points Gang, which is located in Lower Manhattan. During this period, he was employed and trained by fellow racketeer Frankie Yale, who worked as a bartender at the Harvard Inn, a Coney Island dance hall and saloon. Capone accidentally offended a woman while manning the door, and her brother, Frank Galluccio, stabbed him with a knife 3 times on the left side of his face. The wounds earned Capone the moniker Scarface, which he despised. The date when this occurred has been recorded inconsistently. When Capone was photographed, he concealed the damaged left side of his face, claiming that the scars were military wounds. His closest friends referred to him as Snorky, a word for someone who dressed sharply. Capone left New York City for Chicago in 1919 at the request of Torrio, an enforcer brought by mob leader James Big Jim Colosimo. Capone started in Chicago as a bouncer at a brothel, where he most likely caught syphilis. Capone was aware of his illness at an early stage, and appropriate administration of Salvarsan could have likely healed it, but he appears to have never sought treatment. In 1923, Capone paid $5,500 for a tiny house at 7244 South Prairie Avenue in Chicago's Park Manor area. As reported in the Chicago Tribune, hijacker Joe Howard was slain on May 8, 1924, after attempting to disrupt the Capone-Torrio bootlegging operation. In a 1936 piece on Capone's criminal career, the Tribune incorrectly stated the date as May 7, 1923. In the early years of the decade, Capone's name appeared in newspaper sports sections, where he was billed as a boxing promoter. Torrio took over Colosimo's criminal empire following his assassination on May 11, 1920, in which Capone was accused of involvement. Torrio led Chicago's largest organized crime syndicate, which was predominantly Italian, with Capone serving as his right-hand man. Torrio was concerned about getting sucked into gang warfare, so he attempted to negotiate territorial agreements between competing crime organizations. The smaller North Side gang, commanded by Dean O'Banion, faced pressure from Torrio's allies, the Jenner brothers. Despite Torrio's claims to be a conflict settler, O'Banion found him ineffective in dealing with the Jenners' expansion. Torrio orchestrated the murder of O'Banion in his flower store on November 10, 1924. This put Jaime Weiss at the helm of the group, supported by Vincent Drucci and Bugs Moran. Weiss had been a close friend of O'Banion, and the North Siders made it a top priority to exact retribution on his assassins. During Prohibition, Capone worked with Canadian bootleggers to sneak booze into the United States. When asked if he knew Rocco Perry, dubbed King of the Bootleggers in Canada, Capone answered, "Why, I don't even know which street Canada is on." Other sources, however, indicate that Capone had undoubtedly visited Canada, where he had various hideaways, while the Royal Canadian Mounted Police claims that there is no evidence that he ever set foot on Canadian soil. An ambush in January 1925 left Capone startled but unharmed. Torrio was shot many times when he returned from a shopping excursion 12 days later. After recuperating, he virtually resigned and passed over power to Capone, then 26, who became the new leader of an organization that took in clandestine breweries and a transportation network that stretched all the way to Canada, with political and law enforcement protection. As a result, he was able to raise money by engaging in more violent behavior. Any institution that refused to buy booze from Capone was frequently bombed, with up to 100 people killed in such attacks throughout the 1920s. Rivals blamed Capone for the growth of brothels in the city. Capone frequently sought the services of local black community members in his operations. Jazz stars Milt Hinton and Lionel Hampton had relatives who worked for Capone on Chicago's South Side. Capone, a jazz aficionado, reportedly requested clarinetist Johnny Dodds to perform a number he didn't know. Capone divided a $100 bill in half and promised Dodds he'd get the other half after he learned it. Capone also ordered 2 bodyguards to follow jazz pianist Earl Hines on his road trip. Capone enjoyed designer suits, cigars, luxury food and beverages, and female company. He was most renowned for his extravagant and expensive jewels. When asked about his actions, his preferred comments were, "I am just a businessman, giving the people what they want and all I do is satisfy a public demand." Capone had become a national superstar and focal point. Capone established himself in Cicero, Illinois, after employing bribery and mass intimidation to win town council elections, making it impossible for the North Siders to attack him. Capone's driver was tortured and murdered, and Weiss' life was threatened in the Chicago Loop. On September 20, 1926, the North Siders staged a ruse outside Capone's headquarters at the Hawthorne Inn to entice him to the windows. Gunmen in numerous automobiles then fired Thompson submachine guns and shotguns at the restaurant's first-floor windows. Capone was unharmed and asked for a truce, but the talks fell through. Weiss was assassinated 3 weeks later, on October 11, outside the North Siders' headquarters in O'Banion's former flower store. The proprietor of Hawthorne's restaurant was Capone's acquaintance, and Moran and Drucci abducted and murdered him in January 1927. Capone became more concerned about his security and wanted to leave Chicago. As a precaution, he and his entourage would frequently appear unexpectedly at one of Chicago's train stations and purchase an entire Pullman sleeper car on a night train to Cleveland, Omaha, Kansas City, Little Rock, or Hot Springs, Arkansas, where they would spend a week in luxury hotel suites under assumed names. In 1928, Capone paid Clarence Bush of the Anheuser-Busch Brewing family $40,000 for a 10,000-square-foot, 930 square meters, property at 93 Palm Avenue on Palm Island, Florida between Miami and Miami Beach. Antonio Lombardo, Capone's consigliere, was appointed president of the Unione Siciliana, a Sicilian-American benevolent group that had been corrupted by criminals. An enraged Joe Aiello, who had sought the job himself, felt Capone was to blame for Lombardo's rise and despised the non-Sicilians' attempts to influence Unione matters. Aiello terminated all personal and commercial ties with Lombardo and engaged in a fight with Capone. Aiello joined forces with numerous of Capone's adversaries, notably Jack Zutter, who managed vice and gambling operations together. Aiello plotted to kill both Lombardo and Capone, beginning in the spring of 1927 with many attempts. On one occasion, Aiello offered money to the cook of Joseph Diamond Joe Esposito's Bella Napoli Cafe, Capone's favorite restaurant, to put prussic acid in Capone's and Lombardo's soup. Some said he offered $10,000 to $35,000. Instead, the chef revealed the idea to Capone, who replied by sending men to burn Aiello's bakery on West Division Street with machine guns. More than 200 bullets were shot into the bakery on May 28, 1927, injuring Joe's brother Antonio. Several hitmen hired by Aiello to assassinate Capone were killed in the summer and autumn of 1927. Among them were Anthony Russo and Vincent Spicuzza, both of whom had been promised $25,000 by Aiello to assassinate Capone and Lombardo. Aiello finally offered a $50,000 reward to anyone who could remove Capone. At least 12 shooters attempted to collect the bounty, but were killed. Capone's associate Ralph Sheldon attempted to assassinate both Capone and Lombardo for Aiello's bounty, but Capone henchman Frank Nitti had an intelligence network that discovered the transaction and had Sheldon shot in front of a West Side hotel, though he survived. In November 1927, Aiello planned machine gun ambushes across from Lombardo's house and a cigar store frequented by Capone, but those preparations were disrupted when an anonymous tip led police to search multiple houses and capture Milwaukee shooter Angelo LaMancio and 4 other Aiello gunmen. After the police uncovered apartment invoices in LaMancio's pockets, he confessed that Aiello had paid him to kill Capone and Lombardo, prompting the police to arrest Aiello and transport him to the South Clark Street police station. After learning of Aiello's arrest, Capone dispatched roughly 24 gunmen to stand guard outside the station and await his release. The guys made little attempt to disguise their intentions, and reporters and photographers hurried to the location to witness Aiello's impending murder. When freed, Aiello was escorted by police out of the station to safety. He later missed a court hearing after his lawyer claimed he had a mental breakdown. Aiello vanished with some family members to Trenton, New Jersey, where he resumed his struggle against Capone and Lombardo. Chicago politicians had always been involved with dubious techniques, including newspaper circulation wars, but the necessity for bootleggers to be protected in City Hall added a far higher degree of violence and bribery. Capone is widely seen as having played a significant role in the triumph of Republican mayoral candidate William Hale Thompson, who had run on a platform of not enforcing prohibition and had previously hinted about reopening illegal saloons. Thompson reportedly took $250,000 from Capone. Thompson defeated Democratic challenger William Emmett Dever in the 1927 mayoral contest by a narrow margin. On April 10, 1928, during the so-called Pineapple Primary, Capone's bomber, James Belcastro, attacked polling booths in wards where Thompson's opponents were believed to be popular, killing at least 15 people. Belcastro was suspected of murdering lawyer Octavius Granady, an African-American who opposed Thompson's nominee for the black vote, and was followed through the streets on Election Day by gunmen before being shot. 4 police officers were accused alongside Belcastro, but the charges were dismissed after crucial witnesses recanted their claims. An indication of the attitude of local law enforcement toward Capone's organization came in 1931 when Belcastro was wounded in a shooting. Police suggested to skeptical journalists that Belcastro was an independent operator. A 1929 report by the New York Times connected Capone to the 1926 murder of Assistant State Attorney William H. McSwiggan, the 1928 murders of Chief Investigator Ben Newmark, and former mentor Frankie Yale. Capone was commonly considered to have ordered the 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre, despite the fact that he was at home in Florida at the time. The massacre was an attempt to assassinate Bugs Moran, the leader of the North Side Gang, and the rationale for the scheme might have been that some costly whiskey illegally brought from Canada over the Detroit River had been hijacked while being delivered to Cook County, Illinois. Moran was the final survivor of the North Side shooters, after his similarly violent predecessors, Weiss and Vincent Drucci, who were slain in the carnage that followed the assassination of original commander Dino Banyan. Capone's men rented an apartment at 2122 North Clark Street across from the trucking warehouse and garage that functioned as Moran's headquarters, to observe their targets' routines and movements. On the morning of Thursday, February 14, 1929, Capone's lookouts alerted 4 shooters dressed as police officials to launch a police raid. The fictitious cops lined up the 7 captives against a wall and signaled for comrades equipped with machine guns and shotguns. Moran was not one of the casualties. Photos of the murdered victims outraged the public and tarnished Capone's reputation. Within days, Capone was summoned to appear before a Chicago grand jury on allegations of federal prohibition crimes, but he claimed he was too ill to attend. During the Depression, Capone gave to charity and financed a soup kitchen in Chicago to help improve his reputation. The St. Valentine's Day massacre sparked public outrage at Thompson's connection with Capone, which contributed to Anton J. Cermak's victory in the mayoral race on April 6, 1931. Capone was infamous for having other individuals perform his dirty job for him. In May 1929, Frank Rio, one of Capone's bodyguards, discovered a conspiracy by three of his men, Albert Anselmi, John Scalise, and Joseph Junta. They had been convinced by Aiello to overthrow Capone and take over the Chicago outfit. Later, Capone thrashed the guys with a baseball bat and ordered his bodyguards to shoot them, as shown in the 1987 film The Untouchables. Deirdre Bair, along with writers and historians like William Elliott Hazelgrove, have questioned the claim's authenticity. Bair questioned why three trained killers could sit quietly and let this happen, while Hazelgrove argued that Capone would have been hard-pressed to beat three men to death with a baseball bat and would have instead let an enforcer to carry out the killings. Despite allegations that author Walter Noble Burns originally recorded the incident in his 1931 book The One-Way Ride, The Red Trail of Chicago Gangland from Prohibition to Jake Lingle, Capone biographers Max Allan Collins and A. Brad Schwartz discovered variants of the narrative in press reports immediately after the crime. Collins and Schwartz contend that parallels between reported versions of the narrative imply a basis in fact, and that the outfit purposefully circulated the story to boost Capone's dangerous reputation. George Meyer, a Capone associate, claimed to have observed both the planning and execution of the killings. When Capone discovered Aiello's ongoing plan against him in 1930, he determined to finally assassinate him. Capone's men pursued Aiello to Rochester, New York, where he had links through Buffalo crime family chief Stefano Magaddino, and prepared to murder him there, but Aiello returned to Chicago before the plan could be carried out. Aiello, distraught about the frequent need to hide out and the murders of some of his men, moved into Unione Siciliana treasurer Pasquale Patsy Presto Giacomo's Chicago apartment at 205 North Colmar Avenue. On October 23, when Aiello exited Presto Giacomo's building to take a taxi, a shooter in a second-floor window across the street began firing at him with a submachine gun. Aiello was alleged to have been shot at least 13 times before tumbling off the building steps and moving around the corner, seeking to avoid the line of fire. Instead, he proceeded right into the range of a second submachine gun on the third story of another apartment building, where he was fatally shot. Following the St. Valentine's Day massacre, Walter A. Strong, publisher of the Chicago Daily News, petitioned his buddy President Herbert Hoover for government involvement to halt Chicago's anarchy. He set up a covert meeting at the White House barely 2 weeks after Hoover's inauguration. On March 19, 1929, Strong, accompanied by Frank Loesch of the Chicago Crime Commission and Laird Bell, presented their case to the president. In Hoover's 1952 memoir, the former president reported that Strong argued Chicago was in the hands of the gangsters, that the police and magistrates were completely under their control, that the federal government was the only force by which the city's ability to govern itself could be restored. At once I directed that all the federal agencies concentrate upon Mr. Capone and his allies. That meeting set off a multi-agency campaign against Capone. The Treasury and Justice Departments devised preparations for income tax charges against Chicago gangsters, while a small, elite team of Prohibition Bureau agents, including Elliot Ness, was deployed against bootleggers. These lawmen were incorruptible in a city known for corruption. Charles Schwartz, a journalist for the Chicago Daily News, called them untouchables. To aid federal authorities, Strong discreetly utilized his newspaper's resources to obtain and exchange information on the Capone organization. On March 27, 1929, Capone was apprehended by FBI agents as he exited a Chicago courthouse after testifying to a grand jury investigating federal prohibition breaches. He was charged with contempt of court after claiming sickness to skip an earlier appearance. On May 16, 1929, Capone was arrested in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, for carrying a hidden firearm. On May 17, 1929, a grand jury indicted Capone, and he faced a trial before Philadelphia Municipal Court Judge John E. Walsh. Capone was sentenced to 1 year in jail after entering a guilty plea through his counsel. On August 8, 1929, Capone was sent to Philadelphia's Eastern State Penitentiary. A week after his release in March 1930, Capone was named Public Enemy No. 1 on the highly known list of the unofficial Chicago Crime Commission. Capone was arrested on vagrancy charges in April 1930 while visiting Miami Beach. The governor had ordered sheriffs to remove him from the state. Capone alleged that Miami police had denied him food and water while threatening to arrest his family. He was charged with perjury for making these remarks, but was acquitted following a 3-day trial in July. In September, a Chicago court issued a warrant for Capone's arrest on accusations of vagrancy, and he utilized the notoriety to run against Thompson in the Republican primary. In February 1931, Capone was prosecuted for contempt of court. In court, Judge James Herbert Wilkerson intervened to bolster the prosecutor's questioning of Capone's doctor. Wilkerson sentenced Capone to 6 months in prison, but he was allowed to stay free while appealing his contempt conviction. In February 1930, Capone's group was linked to the death of Julius Rosenheim, a 20-year police informant for the Chicago outfit. Assistant Attorney General Mabel Walker Willebrandt is claimed to have devised the strategy of prosecuting clearly rich criminal leaders with federal tax evasion based on their lavish lives. In United States v. Sullivan, 1927, the Supreme Court determined that the technique was legal. Unlawfully obtained revenue was taxed. The key to Capone's conviction on tax charges was not his spending, but his income, and the most crucial evidence in that regard came from his willingness to pay tax. Ralph, his brother and a criminal in his own right, faced tax evasion charges in 1930. Ralph spent the next 18 months in prison following his conviction in a 2-week trial presided over by Wilkerson. To escape the same fate, Al Capone directed his lawyer to regularize his tax status, and while this was not accomplished, his lawyer made critical disclosures when indicating the income that Capone was ready to pay tax on for certain years, conceding $100,000 in 1928 and 1929, for example. As a result, without any inquiry, the government received a letter from a lawyer representing Capone admitting to having a huge taxable income for years on which he had not paid taxes. On March 13, 1931, Capone was accused with income tax evasion for 1924 by a secret grand jury. On June 5, 1931, a federal grand jury indicted Capone on 22 charges of income tax evasion between 1925 and 1929. He was freed on $50,000 bond. Capone was subsequently charged with 5,000 breaches of the Volstead Act, Prohibition laws. On June 16, 1931, in the Chicago Federal Building in the courtroom of Wilkerson, Capone pled guilty to income tax evasion and 5,000 Volstead Act breaches in exchange for a 2+1 2-year prison term. However, on July 30, 1931, Wilkerson refused to respect the plea agreement, and Capone's attorney retracted the guilty pleas. On the second day of the trial, Wilkerson ruled that the 1930 letter to federal authorities may be introduced as evidence, overruling concerns that a lawyer could not confess on behalf of his client. Wilkerson eventually tried Capone exclusively on income tax evasion counts, which he concluded took precedence over Volstead Act allegations. Rudensky was a small-time criminal linked with the Capone gang who eventually became Capone's protection. Rudensky and other convicts' visible protection sparked charges from less favorable inmates, fueling speculation that Capone was receiving preferential treatment. No strong proof was ever discovered, but it was part of the reasoning for sending Capone to the newly established Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary off the coast of San Francisco in August 1934. On June 23, 1936, fellow Alcatraz convict James C. Lucas attacked Capone and injured him superficially. Because of his good behavior, Capone was allowed to play banjo in the Rock Islanders, an Alcatraz prison band that performed monthly Sunday performances for fellow convicts. Capone also adapted the song Madonna MIA and made his own arrangement as a dedication to his wife May. Capone's degeneration became more visible in Alcatraz as neurosyphilis weakened his mental skills. He was officially diagnosed with brain syphilis in February 1938. He spent the final year of his Alcatraz term in the infirmary section, bewildered and disoriented. On January 6, 1939, Capone finished his term at Alcatraz and was moved to the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in California to fulfill his contempt of court sentence. He was released on parole on November 16, 1939, after his wife May filed an appeal with the court citing his diminished mental capacity. The major result of Capone's conviction was that he lost his position as the boss immediately after being imprisoned, although many engaged in Capone's arrest described it as a significant undercutting of the city's organized crime network. After Capone was freed from prison in March 1932 and convicted of tax evasion, his underboss, Frank Nitti, took over as boss of the outfit. Far from being wiped out, the outfit persisted without being bothered by Chicago police, but at a reduced level and without the open brutality that had distinguished Capone's reign. Once Prohibition was ended, organized crime in the city had a lower profile, already afraid of exposure after watching Capone's notoriety bring him down, to the point that there is a lack of clarity among writers regarding who was truly in power and who was a figurehead front boss. Prostitution, labor union racketeering, and gambling were lucrative revenue streams for organized crime in the city without requiring a significant investigation. In the late 1950s, FBI investigators found an organization commanded by Capone's old lieutenants that dominated the Chicago underworld. Some historians believe Capone ordered the murder of Edward J. Aher a week before his release in exchange for assisting federal prosecutors in convicting Capone of tax fraud, although alternative views exist. Capone was released from prison on November 16, 1939, and sent to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore to be treated for syphilitic paresis. Because of his bad reputation, Johns Hopkins declined to treat him, but Baltimore's Union Memorial Hospital did. Capone was appreciative for the kind treatment he got, so he gave 2 Japanese weeping cherry trees to Union Memorial Hospital in 1939. After a few weeks of hospital and outpatient care, a very ailing Capone left Baltimore on March 20, 1940, for his house on Palm Island, Florida. Capone was one of the first Americans to be treated with penicillin once it was mass-produced in the U.S. in 1942. It was too late for him to undo the damage to his brain, but it did halt the progression of his illness. In 1946, his doctors and a Baltimore psychiatrist evaluated him and determined that Capone had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old kid. He spent his final years at his Palm Island estate, spending time with his wife and grandkids. On January 21, 1947, Capone suffered a stroke. He recovered consciousness and seemed to improve, but then developed bronchopneumonia. He had a cardiac attack on January 22 and died on January 25, accompanied by his family at home, when his heart stopped due to apoplexy. A week later, his remains was returned to Chicago, where he was laid to rest privately. He was initially interred in Mount Olivet Cemetery in Chicago. Capone's bones, together with those of his father, Gabriele, and brother, Frank, were interred in Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois, in 1950.